to our agenda. Awesome. So we're going to go through all the maps, but focusing on the different apps that we'll be using to create each of the maps. So you have UMap, Leaflet, the ArcGIS Mapbox, Story Map, RShiny. Then we'll talk about hosting your map for mostly for the coding folks, but it's very low code mostly. So we'll talk about GitHub and GitHub Pages. And then obviously we'll wrap it up. But yeah, so I'll hand it over to our lovely host, Catherine.
And I just caught a typo that we missed. We'll not be using ArcGIS Online for data dashboards. Instead, we'll be using Tableau Public. But yeah, moving forward. So before we start today, I just want to make a quick note about a lot of the software we'll be going over today. And so up to this point, we've, for the most part, been successful in using open source software nearly exclusively. QGIS, Geoda, and R for data wrangling. But today we will be talking about a lot more types of software that are free versions instead of open source. So these might come with more restrictions. And so this is just something to be aware of as you decide which software is the best for you of what we're presenting. And even if you might want to consider looking outside of the software we're presenting, just because there are going to be some maybe usage limits to some of the free versions that we'll be showing. But we have decided to go with them anyway because generally the usage limits are fairly reasonable, and they are very robust pieces of software, which is why we've chosen to continue demoing them instead of finding maybe a less robust open source version. But we'll note which ones are open source and which ones are free. And again, that's just something to look out for when you sign up for any of these pieces of software, just any limitations that there might be with free versions. So this is a graphic that you saw all the way back in module 1, but just wanted to come back to it to just start the refresher. So we'll be looking at 4 different types of data visualizations, asset maps, story maps, thematic maps, and data dashboards. And these range in complexity of data and the interactions that your users will have with them, as well as what their use is for. So asset maps and story maps are more of a reference map type with a variety of complexity between them, story maps being a bit more complex compared to asset maps. And then thematic maps and data dashboards are both more thematic, with data dashboards being the most complex of all of these. So as we've already discussed in previous modules, but just to refresh everyone, an asset map is commonly used in the public health field as a point map for resources. It can be used to identify where resources are and where gaps in availability still exist. It's a simple but effective type of map. And here we see a food resource map for the Urbana-Champaign area. So the two types of software we'll be going over today are UMap and Leaflet JS. So UMap is a web-based mapping program using OpenStreetMap with no coding, and it allows for importing data for asset mapping. And it is open source. Down there you can see an example of a map created in UMap. I think it was a distribution of a certain type of plant was the one that I pulled. But yeah, it's fairly simple to make, no coding. It's probably the simplest map we'll be going over today. And then the other one is Leaflet.js. So it's a popular open source mapping library for creating interactive web maps. And it does involve some coding, hence JS, JavaScript. And that'll just help you customize. There are a few different ways to use it, but today we'll be going over it with CSV files. But you can also use Google Sheets and I think a couple other things with it as well. but Leaflet is also open source. So we're starting off strong with 2 open source softwares. So again, as a refresher, thematic map in public health is a map that uses visual symbols, colors, and patterns to represent specific health-related data or themes within a geographic area. The data interaction complexity generally remains more simplified, bit higher than the asset map that we just took a look at, but still lower than our dashboards. And users are encouraged to inspect visualized patterns. So here we just have a couple of more classic examples of a thematic map. On the left, you see a climate risk map of water stress by county. And on the right, you see a map of the maximum heat index for Chicago from one of our lab's other projects, Chives. So the two softwares we'll be going over for thematic maps are ArcGIS Online, which is a free version of ArcGIS for creating thematic maps, among other map types. And it allows for quite a good deal of customization of data display and symbology. And we'll also be introducing Mapbox GL, which is useful for creating base maps and interactive thematic maps. It does require some basic coding for embedding in web pages, but for those of you not interested in coding, I still highly recommend paying attention to that section. And you don't need the coding for Mapbox. There are other ways to integrate it with other pieces of software that we'll be discussing later, so it's still very useful. And again, both of these are free versions instead of open source. So that's just something to, check what your usage limits are before deciding one way or another which software you want to go with if you're using a thematic map. So StoryMap is a tool that allows users to explore geospatial data in greater detail and with more direction from the creator. So you'll be able to lead users through specific points of interest. You can craft a narrative around your data, incorporate media to add depth in a way that you frequently can't do through other mapping types. And ultimately, it's a story map. You're telling a story through your data. So story maps might be traditional map tours, which is like the basis of what we'll be talking about today. But they might also integrate map tours as part of a larger exploration of the topic, depending on your software of choice. So the two we'll be looking at today are ArcGIS Online again, and StoryMap.js from NightLab, which is I think actually a journalism lab from Northwestern University, but they provide some fantastic data visualization tools. And so ArcGIS is a flexible story map software with the ability to integrate various data visualizations and media elements. And it is also of the two, the much more flexible one, where you can have those like larger explorations that also just happen to have the map tour component of story maps. And again, that's a free version of an otherwise paid service. So StoryMap.js is a straightforward free tool for creating story maps with more basic functionality, and it can be integrated into existing web pages. So StoryMap really just is that map tour component. It's open source, but you'll note the asterisk there. Depending on your base map, you might not be looking at a fully open source project. And this is where Mapbox will be both really useful, but also depending on maybe the amount of traffic you expect, could be an impediment. They have a very limited number of native base maps on their site. So base maps that already exist are already incorporated within StoryMap.js. So a lot of the time that you'll maybe want to make your own base map, and Mapbox is a great tool for that, but that does take a little bit away from the open source aspect of it. So in public health, data dashboards are digital tools that provide visual representations of health-related data and indicators. They can present multiple aspects of public health data hosted in one application. They present this data in a user-friendly format, and they have pretty high levels of user interactivity. So the dashboard you see here is the US COVID Atlas, again, another project from the lab. But people can adjust what variable they want to see. They for certain variables, they can adjust the data range, whether they want to see state or county level, what sort of breaks they want to see. Very interactive, but still fairly easy to interpret. You know, general public might be a little bit intimidated by the amount of interaction, but ultimately it still creates a thematic map and potentially a few other pieces of data to help link everything together. So the two software we'll be introducing for thematic maps are Tableau Public and R Shiny. So Tableau Public allows for the creation of interactive data dashboards with map visualizations, bar graphs, filter actions, and much more. This is a free version of Tableau. And below that, you can see the New York City Neighborhood Health Atlas, which I don't believe is actually Tableau Public, but it is Tableau. And it's where I pulled a lot of the data for this module from. So very useful. And then the other software we'll be introducing is R Shiny, which enables building interactive web applications with R, and it's suitable for creating customized data dashboards, including maps. And here you can see a data dashboard someone created of the Twin Cities in Minnesota, Minneapolis and St. Paul, their bus system. And that one, again, it's R, so it's open source, but it's R, so it's coding. Once again, just keep in mind when you're choosing which one you want to use, kind of what your maybe time or technical constraints are in terms of coding versus what the constraints may be of the applications themselves, especially with Tableau Public being a free version.
So this is one way of hosting your map. There's all of these things depend on your, the technology you've chosen. And a lot of these no-code options, you kind of already have a public location for your map. This is going to focus more on GitHub and using GitHub Pages, which is a really easy place to host a static map that you may have made through some of our other methods that we've described here. So I wanted to start a little bit with background about GitHub, because this is probably something you've seen or maybe used, but don't know much about, or it might look scary. So GitHub is basically just a collaborative platform for storing and sharing code bases and data. And so you can see here's a screenshot of our organization GitHub kind of default page, but you can find any types of code bases or data sets on there because it's used by people all over the world for all different reasons. Researchers, software developers, a news organization may publish a story and include a data set along with it. That data set might be hosted on GitHub. So you may come here as a link to say, download our data. You may find yourself on GitHub. So just a little background on how it's set up. The structure of GitHub is actually pretty straightforward. You kind of have the idea of a user and then the idea of repositories. And a repository is the most important unit within GitHub, and it's just one or more files that are managed together. Could be anything really. But typically it's kind of a collection of files that create a code base. Right here, this is the Toolkit repository. And so these are the files that create the toolkit. And another nice thing to keep in mind is that the URLs that GitHub creates are very simple and organized. And this can really help understand what's going on when you're browsing different repositories. So you have the username and then /repository name, which in the case I was just showing, healthy region /SDOH place toolkit. And then one note here is, so we have this organization as an account, but you can have individual users as an account. So this is important to keep in mind whenever you create a username on GitHub, is keep in mind that username is going to be in all kinds of URLs that point to your own content. Again, here's screenshot. So each of these, it looks just like a file browser on your computer. And you can see there's folders here on the top, and then there's individual files down below. And so it's just a place where you hold files. There's two different ways to edit files in a repo. And I think this is a really nice thing about GitHub, is it has the ability to directly edit right in the interface. And so anytime you click through and you click and look at a file, you may see the content of that file. And then you also see this little edit button. It makes it really easy to make small changes. And that's what I'm going to be showing in a second here. And it just adds a lot of utility to your content. You wouldn't want to create large data sets by hand in GitHub, but the point is that you can upload those through the web's front end, or edit them or delete content actually straight from the front end. So it's good to keep that in mind, because certain elements of GitHub can be very complicated, but there's this really low barrier to entry for the very simple use case that we're showing here. And I think that's important to keep in mind. It's kind of one of those sites where 2% of the capabilities it offers will give you like 90% of what you need. So you don't have to worry about much else that you're looking at. So the other way to edit GitHub file or content that's hosted in GitHub is to do it on your computer. And so this works through a process called cloning, where you basically make a local copy through this clone method. And then there's a multi-step sort of complex syncing process that happens between your local files on your computer and then what is visible and public on github.com. So there's desktop software that is really helpful for managing that process. And like I say here, it's like Dropbox, but more complicated. It can be much more complicated, but conceptually, it's a really robust way of tracking file changes and storing those locally as well as online. Here are just some examples. So GitHub Desktop is probably the simplest and best place to get started if you want to start working locally, and so you're kind of editing files locally and then pushing those edits up to GitHub. Also, there's various code editors like VS Code or even RStudio, which some of you are probably already using. These have integration with GitHub, and it's kind of like an extra tab you can go to, and then all of a sudden you're being able to manage the up and down process, kind of the tracking changes that GitHub supports. And so all of this is based on a utility called Git. But so what is Git? GitHub isn't a random name. It's based on this underlying thing called Git, which I won't go into in detail at all, really, but it's specifically for tracking changes to files. It's a version control system. And again, I won't go through all these, but it just allows you to do these really granular checks on what changes and when within a code base. So now to get to GitHub Pages, this is just a really great feature of GitHub. It allows you to turn any repository into a website, and it's pretty much that simple. So I recommend going to this pages.github.com just for some information. There's plenty of different tutorials out there, and all of them are going to be great. And so this is just a quick overview, really, of what it means. Once you turn a repository into a website with GitHub Pages, the URLs are actually still very predictable and simple. So you'll have your username.github.io / and then the repository name. So if you go to healthyregions.github.io / the name of our toolkit repository, you'll actually find the toolkit. And we did some extra configuration so that it would fit in a different URL as well. But if you go to this one, you'll be seeing the same content because it's served with GitHub Pages. And conceptually, it's actually really straightforward. So you enable the pages in settings, and then any HTML file that you have in your web page is now going to be publicly accessible through the URL, like I've shown here below. And then changes in your repository get rebuilt. It basically rebuilds that into the public page quite quickly, 10 or 15 seconds. And one special note is that you may see this file name index.html a lot, and that's because it's a convention for web browsers, so that if you go to a web page and you don't include a file name on the end, it's going to automatically look for index.html, which means if we use that file name, then we don't have to include it in the URL, which is just prettier. It's easier to remember. So you can always think of index.html as like a home page or a default page. And so that's, if you have one page in your GitHub repository to make a website, then it's going to be called that, index.html. So here's a really, really simple example of a repository that has an index.html page in it. And you can see this is a very simple HTML page. It's got all the pieces of an HTML document. This head section, which this title tag appears in the web browser, like the tab of your browser, and then the body has the content. And so once this repository here has been turned into a website with GitHub Pages, it looks like this, which, isn't something to be particularly proud of design-wise, but just note that this URL up on top is saying that document we were just looking at in GitHub is a publicly facing document. Again, the URL is a little different here because we've made some changes, but I think you could guess what it would be. So just to recap, if you have any HTML file that you want to be hosting online, or any set of files, which may not be something you hand write, but it may be something you download. I think probably StoryMap.js allows you to download a package of the HTML, CSS, all the content that creates the StoryMap.js. For example, you can just upload that directly to a repository in GitHub and then create a web page out of that now anyone can visit.